Thank you. We had a little glitch this morning, so that's a good sign. Good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome to the Scottish Parliament. I'm Claire Adamson. I'm the MSP for the Global Militia and convener of the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee of the Parliament. And I would like to welcome you all to our Festival of Politics. We will have some open remarks from the Parliament, from the panel, and we will have a couple of questions maybe from me, depending on how time is going, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So we look forward to your contributions as well. There will be roving mics if people want to put their hands up, and we'll get a microphone to you for questions. We also have some feedback loops, so if you're on X, you can use @VisitScottParle or Instagram Scott Parle to let us know what your views are on today's events and the discussions. And I'm very delighted to welcome our panel. We have Professor Murray Leith, who's the Professor of Political Science and Director of the CMDCI, Centre for Migration, Diaspora, Citizenship and Identity. That's a bit like my committee, it's like that, it's a mouthful too, at the University of the West of Scotland, and he focuses on Scottish, UK and US politics and society, and has published widely around issues of nationalism, national identity and diaspora. Susan Coftree, has been Director of the International Affairs think tank, the Foreign Policy Centre, since January 2023. She is co-chair of the UK Anti-SLAPP Coalition and SLAPP.
SLAPP, it stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation, which Trump has been accused of potentially utilising, so may come up in the discussion.
Okay. I had a few issues with my microphone in the last session. If you can't hear any of the panel, if you raise a hand and one of the staff will sort it out for you, hopefully. Otherwise, I'll have to shout. So I will try my best. So, sorry, Susan. You're also the co-chair of the UK, no, I've said that bit already, a trustee for the Campaign for the Freedom of Information in Scotland, and an honorary fellow at the City St George's University of London. Warm welcome. Also on the stage we have Robert Moran, who's a partner with the Brunswick Group, a critical issues advisory firm in Washington DC, and Robert is a management consultant, communication strategist, futurist and writer, and his novel is Lincoln 2.0, which explores a near future of AI candidates. And online, and not so early in the morning, but still early, a lot earlier than us, is Jason Boxt. He is the principal of RXN in Washington DC. He's worked in public affairs and opinion research for more than 25 years, with expertise in communications and digital research, reputation and brand management, campaign and message development, and political strategy. And we also have two BSL interpreters with us, Robert Skinner and Beth Malcolm. So I'm going to move to opening thoughts from the panel on today's discussion. And Susan, if I could bring you in first.
Sure, thank you very much. I had the pleasure of actually being here at the panel last year on this topic and hearing Robert and Jason speak, so I'm actually very excited to hear their thoughts 1 year on. I mean, my focus is more on the international, and my career has largely been in the sort of civil society side of things. And so, when reflecting on the title, what does making America, like what has made America great in the past? I kind of thought about 5 kind of key points. One, of course, is kind of leadership around rule of law, the leadership around the liberal international order, the importance of the fight, the promotion and the progression of civil liberties and freedoms, the leadership role that the US has taken in terms of tackling international crime, so particularly in an area of interest of mine, kind of pushing back against corruption, anti-kleptocracy efforts, the work it's done around sanctions, and then sort of fourthly, kind of connected to that, other issues like transnational repression, which is where people are targeted across borders for speaking out on issues, usually about authoritarian regimes. And the US had been leading a lot of that work until recently. And then sort of fifth, the kind of soft power and diplomacy piece, which the US, I think is well known for, and I think it's been very important in recent years in terms of the promotion of democratic norms and principles. Has the US been perfect? By all means, no. I think there would be very valid criticisms of the US on all of those points that I have just mentioned. I have some too. And certainly I can think of a number of issues. I'm sure many in the room can identify concerns about US foreign policy over decades. However, I think there's been a sense, generally speaking, that the US has been a country that's kind of been pulling in the right direction and working with partners around the world that want to kind of advance democratic principles and norms, as I was saying. However, what we've seen, already under the first Trump administration, and now here we are in the second Trump administration, and particularly in the last 6 months, I think what we've seen is a massive acceleration in terms of the backsliding around those issues. And as I said, domestic's not really my area, so I'll leave that to others. But it's deeply concerning where we are now today. So yeah, I think we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of those issues. But I think, yeah, for me, America has lost its potential crown that it had, and it's to be seen whether it will regain it, and what the international community can do to perhaps pick up that piece in the fallout.
Thank you very much, Susan. Is that microphone on? No. Technology is defeating me. Can we have another microphone? Or switched on, please? Sorry about this, folks. It's not because I want you to hear what I've got to say by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that I've been told that there's a problem with Murray's microphone as well. So can we pass this over?
I was going to say, I usually don't have a problem being heard. I'm told my voice carries. How's that? Does that work for everybody? And I won't try and sing because that's even worse. I thought a little of my background, not that this is about me, this is of course about America, but a little of my background. I was actually born here in Scotland. I was born in Kirky. But my parents left Scotland, moved to England when I was 4. But I've been back, and then I moved around and ended up in the United States, where I studied and lived and worked for many years. And I returned to Scotland 25 years ago. I'm an academic. It's a great job. In many respects, it's a privilege. I study nationalism, national identity, belonging, Scotland and the United States. And I've been teaching American politics since George Bush, the dad, was president of the United States. And I continue to teach it, and it's really fascinating for a lot of my students. And that's where it comes into, I'll pick up on some of your remarks, America has changed. America is not the America that we knew growing up. And don't let this youthful visage fool you, okay? I'm actually a little bit older than I look. But America has changed, and it's been changed because of Donald Trump. He's changed the nature of American politics. He's changed the Republican Party, and almost entirely it's now very much a coalition of his supporters. And we cannot rely on the United States internationally the way that we used to. And the United States does not operate domestically the way that it used to. I teach nationalism, folks. I have to be very careful about what I say. Teaching nationalism in Scotland, I'd lose half the room if I made my personal politics obvious. So I've always taught from what I consider the traditional American professor of values free. But I will say this, I am a supporter of the Constitution, and my concern is that the Constitution is being run over roughshod right now. Every president has a go at the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln, one of my personal heroes, ran roughshod over the Constitution on a regular basis. But as he said, he did it to protect the Union, to protect the Constitution. I'm not sure that what we're looking at in the United States today is to protect the Union as much as it is to protect the individual Donald Trump. And I'll pick up on that point, I think, as we proceed.
Okay, I'm going to go straight on and ask Robert to make his opening remarks.
Okay, I don't think I need the mic, do I?
No, you're mic'd up already.
Yeah, okay,
it should be working.
So, just to get to help the audience just think through sort of, I think the first thing we have to discuss is just how we got here. So the Make America Great movement, Make America Great Again movement comes out, sort of grew out of a frustration with feeling that things were off on the wrong track, things were not working, and that people were not making the sort of wage gains that they had hoped, and frustrations. And this comes out of two things: globalization, specifically economic globalization that had winners and losers, and also deindustrialization, which all Western countries have gone through. And I think what happened there was then you had people you had winners and losers. America's elite did not have a strategy for the economic losers in that calculation, other than telling them to learn how to code or something, and that didn't work so well. And so I think what happened is you had America's political elite forget that they needed to make sure the country was wired for success across a range of the economic spectrum. And I think once you had that and you had frustration, it was a jump ball as to which party was going to get that energy. In this case, the Republican Party was weaker after losing to Obama, et cetera. Trump, who was never really much of a Republican, in fact was a Democrat in Manhattan for a long time, sort of reinvented himself and ran and took up sort of bore the standard of this frustration or critique, and that became Make America Great Again. The hat, for example, which is ubiquitous, and I think was an idea from one of the people. And so it's almost like his energy plus the energy of people who were frustrated about the course of the economy and where things were going sort of fused, and that's the movement. The movement took over at least some parts of the Republican Party, and we'll see how much of that continues post. But essentially, if you look at it, many of the tenets of the Make America Great Again movement actually return the Republican Party to what it was like at the end of the Civil War, between the Civil War and World War II, which is, it was a pro-industry, pro-domestic industry development, which was the same general view of the Whig Party, which the Republicans replaced in the Civil War. And it was nationalist and also generally isolationist. And that's essentially what a lot of the policies have returned. So we're not necessarily talking about a new thing in American politics. We're talking about returning to what was the winning formula for the Republicans between the end of the Civil War and the Great Depression. And so that's my view on it, and then we'll see what happens next. And we have a lot of other economic shockwaves to come, so that's an open question about how the economy develops and what that does for the president and the movement that has backed him.
Okay, thank you. And can we bring Jason in finally? Sorry.
Hi, thanks. It's good to be here. It's always a highlight of my year to come to Scotland, either personally or virtually, and accept blame for my previous year's predictions. So, excited to start there. I don't have too much more to add. I do have a couple of points I'd love to make. One is the economy, I think, is often an understated or underappreciated variable in the ebbs and flows of politics, either here or anywhere, really. And I think that coming out of COVID, America was ripe for some kind of a shift, and Bob alluded to that a little bit. There is this question that's been posed about, or at least an assertion that Trump has changed the U.S., and I think it's an open question as to whether Trump had changed the U.S. or whether the U.S. created Donald Trump and the opportunity for him and his advisors to do what they're doing. It's certainly not for debate that what we have seen in the last, and it's unbelievable to me that it's only been 7 months, that what we have seen in the last seven months is a structured, intentional effort to redefine both what is American and what is the American experience. For me, the thing that keeps me up at night
Well, maybe we'll find out. Sorry again, folks. We'll certainly, maybe we should have a wee competition about that. I'm sorry to have lost Jason, but we will get back to him if we manage to get the connection secured. So maybe just reflecting on what's been said, I guess the Make America Great Again slogan and movement had a lot of promises, a lot of slogans around it, but the detail of it wasn't really clear to those people who were falling in against it. So now that we have had 7 months of Trump government again, what do you think the reaction is of people on the ground and the American people who perhaps did vote for him? Do you think they've changed their minds? Do you think they've got voter regret? Or do you think we'll see more of the same? And I think I'll go to Murray first for that, please.
Well, I mean, regrets. I think, obviously some elements, and we see the media do a lot of reports with well, I didn't think they'd do it to me. I thought they were talking about other people, and we know, with the immigration and customs enforcement, we know it's we've got people like Tom Heumann, his borders are saying we're focused on criminals and terrorists, but we know a lot of people who are ending up in detention are neither criminals nor terrorists. So there seems to be this sweeping movement, which is exactly what many of Donald Trump's supporters wanted and voted for and feel strongly about. But it seems to have gone beyond what some of them thought it might do. At the same time, making America great again, it's a lovely phrase because it can mean whatever you think it means as much as whatever Donald Trump thinks it means. And let's be honest, we call it America's original sin, how America deals with its race problem and its divided society, and it hasn't. It never really has. We go back to the Civil War. It's been struggling with it on and off since then. The civil rights movement is just what it is, a movement. And right now, unfortunately, the tide seems to be going in a direction very opposite to what it had been doing for the past 60 years. And that's what concerns a lot of people. We must never forget that whilst he won the election, it was close. It was close. It was a lot closer than people think. But it's a presidential system. Okay, you got Congress. We can come back to that. It's a presidential system. It's winner take all, and he won. And he's taking it all. And what Donald Trump says, and of course that can change from day to day, is what Donald Trump wants to make America great again. And the thing, as I say, with that phrase is it moves around. There is regret. You can see this in the polling numbers, but he's still got 40% of the people regularly supporting him, and that's all he needs to win an election.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Jason back, and I think you're back with us.
I am. What was the question?
So what keeps you up at night, Jason? That's where we lost you.
A lot of things. It is this very intentional strategy of creating multiply overlapping headlines so that the party out of power is unable to really respond or to focus in real time on what's happening and an over reliance, I think, on the structures that are built in that were intentionally placed to slow things down, whether it's the judicial branch and providing this sort of ongoing check on the executive, or the creation of the United States Senate, which was incredibly intentional to bring things almost to a halt. And there's been a complete abdication of responsibility from any of the other branches of government to take a responsible role in slowing things down. You can have an incredibly interesting and healthy conversation about what's happening in the United States right now without uttering a partisan word, because the destruction of our institutional norms is a nonpartisan state of affairs. This idea of a unitary authority in the executive is, it almost feels like we're reverting back to to the debate that was had 200 and some years ago about whether or not the United States wanted a king. And we all thought, I think, that case had been settled 250 years ago. And yet here we are. You just said it, that 40% of Americans, for better or for worse, are supporting this sort of philosophical shift to invest all of the decision-making power in one branch of government. That's what keeps me up at night, because I don't know how we find a path back to a system of government where each of the branches of government has some both responsibility and accountability for sort of protecting this American dream.
Okay, I'm going to finish with the thoughts of Robert on this, and I wonder if you could just, that was mentioned, this issue of the control of Congress, the Supreme Court. You know, how much of that is real and how much you think is illusion?
Sure. Just for the group, just so you have the background, Jason and I both worked in political polling for a very long time. We still do quite a bit of opinion research in our respective firms. Jason came from out of the Democratic side and worked at a Democratic polling firm, and I worked at a Republican polling, two different Republican polling firms for a long time. So even though we have many things in common and generally agree on our sort of analysis of situations because we're looking at the same data, we came from different sides of the aisle. Okay, so boy, in no particular order, here's what I think is going on. First, I think the concerns about the president having some kind of unitary control over the government are a bit overblown. I think if you step back for a second and you look at it analytically, first, the Republican Party, like both political parties, is a coalition. It is not entirely MAGA. There are other voters who are libertarian or who are old school Republicans like myself, who are not necessarily sort of in the MAGA wing. That's the wing that has the energy. But you could even see in the Senate, you had some pushback from different senators who were not really MAGA Republicans. So you've got that. The second issue you have is in the House, because of the tightness of the electorate, you're not going to see huge, massive shifts because most of the seats it's a foregone conclusion. I think in the UK system, you'd call most of our seats rotten boroughs. You know, they've been designed, and that's the impact of computing on congressional districts. And so the issue is that the Republicans in the House have a very slim margin of control. And that's why it was very hard for them to get the one big beautiful bill passed and why they had to make some concessions on some of the tax issues. And so I think if the midterms are a challenge for the president, mathematically and historically they should be, well then there's that natural check because just generically the Democrats should pick up somewhere like 15, 20 seats, and that would give them the majority in the House next time. So that's that. And then the Supreme Court is not a foregone conclusion. He's not happy with them. And so I think there's a number of issues that are checks on the president's power, not the least of which is the facts of the ground. So if you look at Ukraine, the president on the campaign trail was saying, oh, he'll be able to end the war just like that, et cetera. And he had this plan. That didn't work at all because we're constrained by reality. And the reality has constrained, and we're still stuck in that reality. And so essentially it looks like he's going to go back and mimic the Biden strategy, which is not what he ran on, but is what he's going to have to do because that's just the reality on the ground.
Okay. Murray, I think you might have had a differing view about the control.
Well, I would just point out that, you know, I mean, at the end of Trump's first term, the Cato Institute said that he had broken some of the norms of politics and that he'd coarsened, the exact words were coarsened the U.S. political culture. I think he's broken it. He's broken it. This is a man who sits in the White House, and just take a look at a picture of what he's done at the White House, who sits at the White House and talks about running for a third term. And I know people say, oh, he's joking. Donald Trump doesn't joke, okay? That these are, if he could find a way around that, I mean, I don't think he's going to be physically capable. I mean, he's got some of the questions that Biden faced, but he doesn't face the questions that other president faced. You know, he's the way he operates and the way he moves and the political support structure that surrounds him allows him to evade a number of things that any other president would be over the head with on a daily basis.
$100 and 2 shots of whiskey. He doesn't run for a third term.
Well, if you
I'll put the money in your pocket. You can return it to
listen,
me in a
I'll be
couple of
happy,
years.
and I will go home and sleep tonight. Much better if you feel that is the case.
Happen. It's not gonna happen.
Okay, all right. I'll tell you what. Seriously. Good whiskey.
$100, $100 and 2 shots says he doesn't run.
Not bourbon, real whiskey.
Whatever, yeah.
I hope we're not breaching parliamentary rules, but I think the bet like this in the Parliament.
Hey, let's do side bets. It's all good.
Susan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just pick up on Jason's point and what's been touched on about accountability. Like, regardless of, Trump's overall control and whether or not he will run for another term, he's certainly gone around dismantling, the mechanisms by which a president and any politician really can be held to account. I think it's quite remarkable, the attacks that his administration have led on lawyers, on law firms, also on the media. I mean, he's really ramped up his attacks on the media. I mean, he sort of started with that in his first term, fake news right from the beginning. But the amount of lawsuits he's opened, him and his businesses have opened against media outlets. He's forced 2 big media operators in the US to give pretty hefty settlements, 16 million. He's currently suing, the Wall Street Journal. I think there is real validity in the concerns about the way the country, the direction it's going, and the ability for the public to really, have scrutiny over what's happening. And he's doing it for, talking about America first. I think, frankly, it's Trump first and whoever's flavor of the month second, And whoever that is sometimes the last person, that he's met and spoken to in the room as it happens. But I think you can see from, and the domestic picture is not really my area, but the Corporate Transparency Act, which was a big piece of legislation that came through under the Biden administration, his administration have really gutted that. And that's quite critical because it was really aiming at trying to shut down the use of anonymous shell companies, to try to stop kind of international crime. The US, as a leader in that area, I think have vacated the seat. And so, accountability not just for Trump, but for a number of different areas which will have an international impact is of real concern as well.
Okay, I think I'm going to move to questions from the audience. Can I see some hands up? Oh, a hand straight up over here. Okay.
Hi, thanks for that. It was just to ask about the current, whether it's smoke and mirrors or whether it's a threat to US democracy, the gerrymandering that they're talking about in both Texas and California at the moment was my first question, quick one. Second one is, it was also mentioned about sort of isolationist policy, the Great Depression. What part did isolationism cause in that? And is isolationist policy today in the US likely to result in something similar and more catastrophic financially globally later down the line? Because we can see a lot of that sort of under the radar, not necessarily in mainstream news.
Okay, I think I'll go to Jason first. Is that okay?
Lots of thoughts on gerrymandering.
I'm happy to start because I know Bob's going to weigh in on the gerrymandering question. I had written Texas in the margins of my notes during the previous question. I will address the isolationism piece, and I know the other panelists will have a point of view on this. I think one thing that we've not really touched on is the impact on science and America's role in scientific discovery. And I wonder, and I question whether it is an isolationist policy that is causing X, Y, or Z, which I think the questioner was asking, and rather I think it's a more of a, are the specific things that are being done by this administration forcing something that looks like isolationism. The impact on science, I think, is something that's underreported. The loss of funding and confidence in both both the government's lean into science, but also in this sort of global perception of the role that the United States plays in scientific discovery. I think we're going to be feeling the effects of that for a very long time. I actually think it's an interesting opportunity for the UK and for Scotland, even more specifically, to assume that mantle of scientific innovation. We've scientific innovation and the process of scientific discovery is not a market. Is not a market-based process. Scientific discovery often is done in the absence of projected or specific goals or outcomes, but rather in the pursuit of the possibility of what we can learn. And I think what this administration has done has shifted the scientific model to a specific market-based outcome, which I think is going to be debilitating for the U.S., for the healthcare industry, for scientific innovation, with the exception of Silicon Valley, which seems to be moving full speed ahead. I think that's going to be a problem for a very long time. And I think it will force then the United States to assume an isolationist role, because I think that has been one of the underpinnings of our global leadership in the last 75 years, is the fact that nearly every great scientific and medical discovery has come from the United States, and I think that era is done.
Okay, Robert?
Yeah, so great questions. I think, so first, the isolationist impulse. I think what you're seeing here is not exactly isolationism, but a push from his own political coalition to refocus American resources on America, which comes out of exhaustion and frustration and a reaction against the Bush-era decision on Iraq and Afghanistan, which turned out to have boomeranged on the Republicans and been very negative, and now is being viewed as a huge sort of colossal mistake. And so the isolationist tendency is really all about is being interpreted in the United States as how do the Americans reconstitute American investment back in America as opposed to other transnational institutions. I think the challenge here for democracies generally is, people have generations move on and people forget. And so, the administration, I think, does not believe just in soft power. It only believes in hard power. And it's transactional, which is a challenge then if you're trying to lead a big league of democracies of NATO. And I think that it's interesting that now he seems to be going back towards the involvement of NATO, seeing its value. And so I think there's something there. In terms of gerrymandering, very quickly, for those in the audience, as you probably know, the United States is a federal system. Each of the states, after the census, gets to draw their lines for their districts. This has become a weird political football where states like, I don't even know where Wisconsin is on this now, but they had a big Supreme Court justice election in Wisconsin, and they may or may not redraw their lines. And so what you've got is this weird sort of brinksmanship thing where one state decides to redraw its lines and then other states threaten to redraw their lines to maximize the partisan advantage of that congressional delegation being sent to Washington. And they're allowed to do this because in many states, the Republicans or Democrats have all three levels of power in that state, the trifecta. They control the legislature, the executive, and the Supreme Court, and then they can do what they want, right? And so my last point would be that three things created a lot of political polarization in America. Number one is computing power. We could always gerrymander. Gerrymandering is a very old idea. It goes back to very early in American politics. I personally helped gerrymander Pennsylvania twice, but we did it with beer and not good computers. Now you have much better computers. So compute is the number one thing that made America more polarized. The second is jet travel. Because of jet travel, members of Congress could fly home to their districts on the weekends. So they didn't hang out and play poker and play softball and get to know each other. They go back to their gerrymandered districts. The third is the end of the draft. We had a military draft in this country during World War II and then afterwards, and that meant that virtually all the male members of Congress had served in a branch of the military, and they could connect over that. The end of the draft meant they couldn't even connect over cross-cutting military service. And so in my view, those three things have created a lot of polarization, but one of the follow-on effects is more effective gerrymandering, where the political leaders can choose their voters as opposed to the other way.
Okay, Marie?
That's the big problem. That's the big problem right there. The political leaders are choosing the voters. The voters aren't choosing the political leaders. American people are like, hold on a minute, we're voting the same way, but all of a sudden the Republican Party gets 5 more seats in Texas because they've redrawn the boundaries? Democracy isn't even in the discussion anymore. You know, the American dream, which we could talk about what that is and what that means and what that says, but this idea of one person, one vote, that's gone. That's gone. You know, the politics playing seems to have forgotten the idea that power derives from the people. It's a fundamental American basic tenet, which seems to, as I say, have totally gone out the window. And that leaves democracy in a very challengeable position, especially when it comes to a highly polarized society, where you're absolutely right. America's become much more, we left polarization, we started talking about hyper-polarization. And what's next? It's not pretty.
You okay? I wonder if I could just, before we go to the next question, just pick up on that issue about science. So we saw, I suppose, memorable news pictures from Mr. Trump during the coronavirus crisis, talking about, you know, shining lights into people's bodies and things like this. So we know that he doesn't really understand a lot of science as such, which is not a problem if you're listening to the experts. But what we also see is not just with that kind of lack of knowledge, the impact that will have for climate policy. And I wondered if anyone wanted to reflect on that. You've got the microphone. Do you want to go first?
I'll fully admit I'm not a specialist on climate policy. I can talk about, we go back to the point Susan made earlier about America being the leader, especially of certain coalitions. I mean, we talked about NATO, but of course there's also the Paris Climate Agreement. You're in, you're out, you're in, you're out. You know, and isolationism versus America first. These are, of course, historical trends. America being the world leader was actually bucking the previous trend of American history. And it's something, America's going back to its roots in many regards, making America great again. It's certainly making America the way it was again. And I fully agree with your comments on that. And it reflects an America of the previous century, not the 20th, but the previous century much more, you know. And you talked about the Whigs and that. There was a party called the Know-Nothings, of course, you know, and they were proud that, well, I know nothing. And you're almost seeing that same pride in a certain, and I hate to use the word ignorance because it sounds like an insult. I don't mean it as an insult, but I'm not interested in anything outside of our borders.
Well, I think part of it is that the United States is such a large country that if you live in the state of Texas, you could move and drive 4 or 5 hours and move your house and get a job, and you're still in the state of Texas. So before the Civil War, most Americans thought about the United States as an emphasis on the last word, states. And so they thought of they almost thought of their state as a country, and then the United States is this conglomeration of countries, right? And a lot of Americans still think that way. I think also, you know, the country is so large, and there's always been an impulse in the United States that does not want to be the world's police, or, you know, and a lot of American voters, you know, and Trump did win a plurality of the American vote, feel like, you know, the U.S. is over-indexed on sort of leadership and that not every solution, not every problem has an American solution, you know, and that's kind of their view. And I'm not necessarily endorsing it. I think that democracies must hang together in some kind of an alliance. But I think that that's where a lot of the American people are, where they're sort of skeptical of American international relations.
Jason, you've got a final thought?
Yeah, I appreciate Murray's discretion in avoiding the use ignorance, but I do think there is, to a certain degree, a disinterest in understanding things beyond sort of the immediate scope of your sort of day-to-day life. I don't disagree with Bob at all. I think that the country has become so big, and there is a real move away from any kind of a shared American experience. We are truly the sort of coat of many colors, and not in a way that the coat looks fashionably attractive. It's actually a pretty ugly coat right now because there isn't a lot tying things together. I do think that it is problematic in the absence of any kind of shared understanding of what that American experience is. It can only lead to more dissonance, more sort of regional and even state focused bias toward political outcomes. I'm not a I've made a habit in the last 15 years or so of coming to Scotland of making really bad political predictions. So why should I stop now? Bob and I have talked about this a little bit, but the individual actions that you're seeing with Texas or potentially California, you know, we're setting ourselves up for a scenario in which these individual states who don't suffer from the size problem of the lack of a shared experience might start questioning the feasibility and the benefit of being part of a confederation where they gain no value. And you know, are we seeing the beginnings of sort of a bloodless civil war, where countries like where states like California, New York, or Texas or Florida, for that matter, decide that the values that they see as truly American are unique to their own state and experience, and it's just not worth that sort of leap of faith into a broader sort of American experience.
Okay. Can see hands up again? I'll take a microphone at the front left here, and I'm looking around the room to see. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Could I take you back to your observations about the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary? You cannot possibly have a country which is great without an independent judiciary at state level and at national level. So my question to you is, how does civil society in America rise up to say, to use Churchill's expression, up with this we will not put? So your solution to that dilemma, because it must be, the nettle must be grasped.
Alison, do you want to come in on that one?
I mean, I'm not an expert on domestic politics, so I will leave that to others. But what I would say is I think there's an unraveling of like the social contract and our understanding, both at a national level and an international level, of norms in which we can trust, and that if someone says something, you're going to do it, or at least to the best of their ability, and that if there's an agreement, and everything else is chaos beyond that point. If everybody's just out for themselves and there's no rule of law, what you end up with is chaos. And I don't think that can be possible at a domestic level or an international level. And so that concerns me greatly. But yeah, very interested to hear what the domestic landscape
Robert
is.
in.
So I think you have different political observers looking at the same data and drawing different conclusions. For the group, it's important to note that that at the state level, many of our members of the judiciary at the state get elected as in the Supreme Court. Those are state elections, interestingly enough. At the federal level, all judges that I'm aware of are, well, not all, they're administrative law judges. That's somewhat different, but almost all judges are appointed by the president, confirmed by Congress, and then they sit. And I'm not aware of them having any sort of mandatory retirement. So many federal judges serve for a very long time until they don't want to or they are deceased. So that's how the system works. So that means on any bench in any district, you will have judges that have been appointed and confirmed by different presidents and different Congresses, same as you see in the Supreme Court. So I think right now in the United States, you'll see executive orders by the president and then rulings by various judges trying to stop those orders. The media will play that as sort of judicial resistance or restraint to the president. The president's folks will look at that and say that it's a judicial coup, that all the folks that are issuing restraining orders against whatever the executive order is, they all happen to be democratically appointed justices. And so they view it as a judicial coup and that they were duly elected by the people and ran on the things that they're doing. And so I'm just trying to give you a sense of that this is how two different groups of people look at the same facts and view them differently. The Republicans right now are saying this is a judicial coup. The American people gave us the power to do these things. We ran on these things. This is what we're doing. It's within the president's right from executive order, which is debatable. And then the media and the Democratic side are saying, no, you know, this is the resistance to the president based on judicial arguments, et cetera. So that's essentially where we are now, just to make sure that there's a clarity on what both sides are claiming.
Murray?
But the problem is, you know, and I would agree, but the problem is, of course, the president's writing executive orders in which he has no constitutional authority to do. The president of the United States does not control voting. That is a state-controlled issue. The president of the United States doesn't control education. That's a state-controlled issue. Now, how he does it, of course, is through the money and the funding and all that. But the constitutional guardrails are quite clear about this. And you're right, when a judge then issues a ruling, it's, you know, framed in the medium and it's framed by the actors as a judicial coup. But that's what we're looking at right now, is a president who is not interested in following the constitutional rule of order and who is only interested in passing things that the judges then are stepping in and say, well, you don't have authority to do that. You can't do that. But then, of course, the Trump administration just says, yeah, well, we're doing it anyway.
I guess the issue is, just for the group, the issue is every president has executed or has conducted executive orders. This president has increased the number of executive orders. I think it's complicated in that some executive orders appear to be well within his reach as the executive, and some are debatable. One theory is that they're using some of these executive orders to push the boundary to see what the court will let them have. Which feels very Trumpy, and others are not. So some executive orders are obviously within his realm of power, given that he has the executive branch. Others are debatable and questionable. I think traditionally in American politics, anything, for example, that would be touching a cabinet agency and its funding, the president would request a budget that would zero that funding out and then would want Congress to do that, as opposed to sort of taking it to the next level. So I think it's complicated, and each executive order is different. And I think the challenge here, which Jason alluded to, is that the president's team had a very deliberate strategy of pushing on many fronts at once for their agenda as a way to win, basically incapacitate their political opposition because it's too fractured so that they could keep pushing and winning, right? And so I think that's the issue here, but executive order by executive order, these are somewhat different things. Like some of them I think are definitely a stretch, some of them aren't, and that's the problem I think that journalists have right now in reporting it.
Jason? Yeah.
Yeah. I would I'd like to just make a couple of very, very quick points. One is, despite the actual framing, it has been often the case in the last few months that judicial rulings that have come out in opposition to Trump White House activities have been initiated by Republican-nominated judges, which is, I think, neither here nor there in the scope of things. A judicial ruling is a judicial ruling, but at least to reflect on the framing that these are somehow sort of Democratic nominations that are intentionally, in a partisan way, undermining a Republican president. That has not really been the case in the last 7 months. The sort of add on to that, I would say, is that what is really dangerous here is by turning by this framing of judicial resistance or some kind of a judicial undermining of an elected president's agenda, really goes at this sort of trust issue and undermining both American trust and international trust in the United States as a system defined by the rule of law, and it takes us closer, I think, to this perception of a banana republic where all the and I know Bob said this earlier, and he may not have been speaking directly about me, but the idea that we're exaggerating the destruction of these norms. I don't think it's an exaggeration to point out that there is a causal relationship between adherence to rule of law and the trust that we invest in the system. The last thing I will add, which is a purely partisan Molotov cocktail, and I apologize. Bob, I would say this to you if I were sitting next to you. This practice of the Republican Senate disallowing the nomination process of Democratic appointed judges in the last year or 18 months or the last 6 months, this sort of arbitrary obstacle to preventing an elected president from being the president for the full 4 years of his term. This is a relatively new phenomenon, and it is one that was absolutely initiated by Republican Senate. We were worried about it at the time, but at the time it seemed more of a political nuisance. I'm not assigning any kind of causal effect here, but we are now in a place where we don't believe that the system is going to adhere to sort of the constitutional standard, but it's rather now becoming more of this sort of normalized in the moment political acceptable standard, and I think it's just really bad.
Right. I think because people are sort of eschewing some of the guardrails of the past, it makes it worse. And by the way, Jason's right. I forget which executive orders, but several executive orders were flagged by judges who were Bush-era appointees. I think it was all Bush-era appointees. So.
Okay, I'm looking for the hands in the room. Again, I shall go to this gentleman at the end of the row here.
Observation.
It really has struck me the amount of diversity, particularly in the flyover states and things, where I came across so many people who didn't know very much about what was going on in judging what's happening in the US by European standards, and that we need to start thinking about it differently. And I wonder whether people on the panel think that's fair, and also, do they think that it may be that when history comes to be written, we are beginning to see a decline of the US as one of the great states or the great countries in the world that we live in. After all, the Roman Empire had some very many bad emperors that made Trump look very reasonable before it totally declined.
Thank you for that question. Susan, do you want to come in or?
I mean, a couple of thoughts. One, a state in and of itself, and its populace are not one. Multitudes of views and interests within a country. So, I'm thinking of the US, and particularly in my remarks when we opened about how the state, the country of the US has engaged in the world, and the retreat, I would argue, that we've seen of that. And I think the US as a state has been involved in the international stage on all of those issues, at least since the Second World War. And the kind of international order that we see now has been front and center of the US has been and a particularly strategic partner of the UK in all of those efforts. Maybe just kind of harking back to the point, that Robert was making, not that you were saying it yourself, but reflective of perhaps some opinions inside of the country. The US was not, the world's policeman, out of the goodness of its own heart. It understood that it was important for its own domestic, landscape, and that international crime, kleptocracy, corruption, they have an impact domestically in the US, in the UK as well. I mean, the amount of kind of illicit funds that have gone into rural businesses, industries, driven up house prices, seen the collapse of some industries because illicit wealth is very rarely used to actually, invest properly and further those industries. So that's happening inside of countries. And I think the US was quick to recognize that. Under the Biden administration, corruption was recognized as a threat to national security, that it was impacting, media, all kinds of things. The transnational repression aspect I spoke about earlier. I could go into loads of detail, and I don't want to occupy all the time. But my point is there is an interplay between those things, and I think yes, we have different standards and different things. But I think if we're looking at how the world order has been and where it's going now with the US's retreat, I think we should care. We should all care.
Anyone?
So, I would say your question is interesting, and you referenced the word empire, so I thought that was fascinating. I think that it's exactly the point. You have a number of American voters that don't want an empire, right? And so it's not pure isolationism, but it's a walking back of a level of engagement that the United States has historically had. And I think that's a big impetus within the sort of MAGA movement, which is, if we take it out of the normative realm for a second and we just say it's neither good nor bad, but it just is, and then what does that mean? It's actually very interesting. What it means that the likelihood is that you'll have a Democratic president that will follow Trump. So normally in American politics, you have one flavor and then followed by a very different flavor, and you kind of do that, right? And so we'll see, but my guess is that's what you look at. But let's assume for a second that the sort of MAGA impetus has legs and continues to sort of drive American politics. Then I think you're looking at a United States that is less demonstrative in terms of what it wants, much more transactional, both with democracies and non-democracies, and maybe less energetic in terms of how it uses its force, choosing to focus on just major areas of its economic interest, which would be the Pacific Rim, which is the Trump focus right now, is the Pacific Rim. And I'd close with one other thought, which is that, you spoke to the diversity of America. Our immigration patterns have changed quite a bit nowadays. And so you have a lot more people coming from Latin American countries and Asian countries. And so I think that also changes the way American voters think about the world as well. And I do think that there's a lot of questions about hemispheric relations. We're obviously in Europe, so that's NATO and how you think about that. But I think there are very big open questions about how the US would operate with Canada and Mexico and the rest of Latin America. I think that that's very important to the United States in terms of the future. And I think it's not very clear which way that's going right now. So,
Mike.
I'm just going to make a couple of quick comments. One is, I'm always personally shocked that there are people who are not interested in politics. They're strange people. And I know I'm talking to the wrong crowd on this one, but the vast majority of people don't care on a daily basis. I come from a family where they're still trying to figure out how I turned out. None of the rest of my family care about politics. And they don't, they vote, and that's it. And half the time, I weep silently because they do not know what they're voting for. And they don't care to know. And I love them dearly. Don't tell them I said that. The other thing is because the diversity issue came up. I'm going to point a little thing. We talk about diversity, Kabine, and let's not get into the whole DEI and the attacks on that. I'm going to point it out with one example. 7th of December 1941, a day which will live in infamy, of course, and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Doris Miller, an African-American sailor, was on USS West Virginia. And it was attacked, of course, it was in Pearl Harbor, it was attacked. And he ran upstairs because his job in battle stations was loading. African-American sailors, of course, could not hold combat posts on board at this point in time. He was a laundry mess assistant. He did just that, the laundry, and cleared up dishes. He found his gun captain injured and lying next to the gun. He moved him, and then he took over the gun and defended his ship against all the rules. He won a Congressional Medal of Honor. The webpage that outlined his personal story was taken down recently, and it wasn't put back up because he's a diversity Congressional Medal of Honor winner. That's a problem.
Oh, I didn't know that was what that one. Jason, do you want to come in?
No, I think we can go ahead and
Okay.
open it up for more questions.
Okay, just on that point, one of Trump's orders has been to starve some of the organisations of money and funding. So public sector broadcasting and radio has been hit very hard in America. What impact do you think that will have on the populace?
Jason, you want to take that?
Okay.
I put that executive order sort of in the same category. It's NPR, it's Voice of America, but as you think about it's sort of the whitewashing of American history. These recent complaints about the Smithsonian being too focused on, maybe slavery wasn't so bad, or slavery wasn't as bad as they're making it out to be. I think anytime someone comes into power with a vision toward maintaining that power, it's in that person's best interests to control not only the flow of information, but the content of that information. And I think you're seeing a systemized effort by the Trump White House to both change the way people are evaluating recent history and current history, but also to control the levers and the way in which people get that information. The media landscape has been shifting for a long time, but and there's always been, by the way, sort of this small but outspoken group of people who have railed against public broadcasting and the role of the state in providing a forum for information, whether you think it's biased or not. But the idea that we are removing funding both domestically and internationally from some kind of a moderated view of current events, I think has tremendously negative implications over the next 10, 20, 50 years.
So, can I respond a little bit equal time on this one? Very quickly. So, so what we're talking about is taxpayer funds for state-run radio and television. I think some of these are different things. So, Voice of America, obviously, Cold War era, pro-U.S., pro-democracy communication. That's one thing. And then there's NPR, which is both radio and television in the United States. A very small percentage of its budget is actually federal tax dollars. It could probably operate without any tax dollars. And I forget what it is, Jason, you probably remember. It's like 8% or something?
It's like between 5 and 8%.
Right. So you could either look at this and say, we should pay the 5 to 8% of its operations to keep it going, or it doesn't need it. It already raises, it already gets 92%, it's fine. And so I'm generally of the view that it could be spun off and just be handled by donations and everything else that it's done, because it right now is operating with 92%, give or take, non-government funds. And so I think that's what the argument is right now in large measure. Conservatives have for years wanted to spin off, not get rid of, but spin off NPR and just say it could just be its own thing and funded by, philanthropy or what have you, but not state-backed. And they had concerns about state-backed media for obvious concerns about state-backed media. So.
I was just struck by and this is just been the huge cultural difference between the United States and the United Kingdom there. Obviously, this is the land of the BBC. So, from that perspective, we're big fans of state media and a lot of European countries are as well. Whereas, of course, the American things take it. So that struck me as a big cultural difference. But my comment is, as an academic and also, the many universities under challenge, and we go back to Jason's comment about, some of the scientific funding and elements of that being withdrawn from universities. When governments start saying, we're restricting your access to information, or we're not giving money to support this, we're not giving money to support that. And when a government starts banning books, which of course has always been an element of American society, so we ban books on this side of the pond too, it makes me very nervous. And when that's done, come on.
But hear me out. The idea is not that you would end NPR. It's just that it wouldn't get tax revenue. If it's already running on, let's say, 92% is non-tax revenue, we're not saying that their argument is not that it would end. Their argument is just that it wouldn't. People wouldn't be putting their taxes towards something that is always going to report in a way that they just can't stand. So the idea is it just gets spun off. That's not censorship. In fact, it's the opposite because it's not state-backed.
Yes, but
it would just be, it would have a board, it would have philanthropies, different foundations could give to it.
When that 5 and 8% is often then used to say, look, we've got 5% here, can you match it? And you can, and they get matching from philanthropy and private funding organizations, which is what the base builds from. You take one brick out, fine, you take 5 and 8 bricks out and the building starts to wobble. The bottom line is, one of the things that the Trump administration has is a huge backing by certain media organizations who are regularly parroting the line, and a lot of Americans are listening to this on a daily basis. And when a government says, we want to stop giving you money because you're saying things we don't like, you're on dangerous territory.
Okay, is a lady here just in the middle? Lady in the, that's.
Thank you. In terms of how we got to here, and I heard globalization, deindustrialization, the swamping of the media with what I would call balloon language that people absorb very easily. What I haven't heard, and I'm very interested in the panel's view of, is to what extent, if any, do you think there has been an influence of fundamental evangelicalism, if that's a word, fundamentalism in terms of the evangelical community over a great many years? And has there been an impact and an influence by that particular section of the population of the US?
Oh, that's a big one. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that one. Jason? No, nobody's, oh, Murray.
No,
One of the joys, again, and I realize it's a privilege being an academic, is, as students doing research around these things. I had a student do a research project around Christian nationalism a couple of years ago, and there's no doubt that amongst the Trump tent and his rebuilding of the image of the Republican Party and the contents of the Republican Party, is Christian nationalism is a large element of that. We see Pete Hegseth appointed, of course, as Defense Secretary, and there's been a bit of a stushy over his social media posting of some of his pastors' words that women shouldn't get to vote. But it's important, when a public official makes announcements, and a social media posting is a public announcement. When they make an announcement and they won't retract it, they won't say, I disagree with this. And of course, they're saying I can neither confirm or deny. That's an issue, but there's no doubt America's a very religious society. It's always been a very religious society. It maintains its religion at a level that we struggle to really understand. Our census, you may not know this, our census, 51.1% of people living in Scotland reported not having a religion. So we're now officially a majority unreligious society, and the concept of that in America would probably freak a number of them out.
Right, we have a different political culture and just a different, generally a different culture in that regard. I think, so my answer would be that the impact of evangelicalism and fundamentalist views of the Bible, for example, probably peaked in the United States in George W. Bush's re-election of 2004. And that the impact of what we would generically call the Christian right has sort of declined net over time. And I say this having worked in Republican polling for a long time before going to commercial work. I think that the research shows that Trump's most strongest supporters actually are not as church connected. On the other hand, we also have data that shows that evangelical Christians gave Trump a very high percentage of their vote. They're not necessarily big backers, but they gave him a high percentage because he cut a deal with, essentially no one is under the illusion that Donald Trump is up for sainthood. As a lapsed former Catholic, I say, no one's under the illusion that Donald Trump is up for sainthood, including evangelicals. But they know they know that he's a deal maker, and they know that this is a deal he will not go back on because it's too close to his interests. And so they support him for transactional reasons. But I think it's an interesting question. But I think what's happening is that basically, I think evangelicalism's peak was probably around 2004 and the George W. Bush re-election campaign. With that said, there's an interesting indication that suggests that Gen Z men, so younger millennial men, have been returning to church, which is very interesting, and been more interested in faith, but not Gen Z women. So that's an interesting, we're still that's a very new phenomenon, but it makes sense with the consumption of sort of social media that looks at it like a Stoic philosophy has been very popular among younger people recently as well. So.
Anyone else want to comment on that one? I've not seen anyone jump in, right? Yeah.
I would just say that religious language does dominate in many aspects of regular political discourse in the US, and it is something we struggle to understand, but it's just perfectly natural in US political culture.
I think it's healthy in a democracy. Like, you have Catholic politicians that have been open about speaking about their faith ever since John F. Kennedy got elected. I think that was good for us. I think it's good that you have Jewish politicians that speak openly about their faith. Same with Muslim politicians and Protestant politicians. And so I think it's fine in democracy to say this is who you are as a human. Right. Right. If you're trying to put your one view through, yeah.
Yeah. Marie.
I was just going to say, on that point, I find it very fascinating that a lot of Catholic organizations are holding prayers outside of ICE facilities, holding public prayers to support the people in detention. That shows how the religion does cut across political lines at certain key points.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm going to go up to the back of the room. We've not been up there yet. So there's a gentleman over here. Stand up.
Bob, you mentioned at the outset that the economy is underappreciated in all this, and given some of the data, the work you've done and some of the data, is there an economic profile of the typical Trump supporter that's distinct and different from the rest of the U.S.? And what economic variables are you watching to see how the tide turns?
So Jason and I, we're going to be good on this one. I think because we have the same data. Basically, what's happened is if you go back to the George W. Bush re-election of 2004, in that era, Republicans still did very well with college-educated voters. What's happened since then and the MAGA movement is that basically Republicans and Democrats have switched some voters. What you've seen is you've seen some higher educated college voters who were traditionally higher income Republicans switch over and become Democratic voters, and you've seen non-college educated, especially non-college educated whites, flip over from being Democratic and like union voters to Trump voters. And I think you've seen a little bit of this in the UK as well, but that's definitely a phenomenon that you've seen. And I think one of the big open questions is, to what degree will the tariff policies, for example, create economic drag that people would see and feel and be frustrated with and maybe say, right? And I'm remain very skeptical of the, I understand what they're trying to do. I'm a free trader, so I disagree with it. I disagree with the philosophical goal, and I'm also have a lot of questions about the execution of that goal. But we'll see. And I think that would be a problem. But Jason and I look at the same data, so what do you think, buddy?
Yeah, I think that question, when it was put to us in 2016, the first time that Trump ran, I think it was very, very clear that he was speaking to a particular profile of voter that was lower class, lower to middle, lower class, working class. And I think the point that Bob made is true, is that we've seen a flip a bit, and that all of a sudden we see more elites. It used to be that the Republican Party was the sort of elite party, at least economically, and that has shifted a little bit. I think as you think about moving forward, the equation always changes. The political equation always changes when the economy is doing well. And what we saw, whether it's a causal shift or whether it was just correlated, but coming out of COVID, the frustration that Americans felt with their economy, which was a frustration, and we touched on this in last year's festival, the COVID impact globally on incumbent parties, it was universal. What we saw and I think what really enabled Trump to become the president was not because he was such an awesome candidate, but because he was the alternative to an extension, to a continuation of the Joe Biden economic policy, which didn't stand a chance in sort of this post-COVID economic political reawakening. I think as we move forward, Bob's point is right. Whether the economy continues to drag, whether the perceptions of the economy dragging remain, because as many of you I'm sure know, public opinion about the economy is always a lagging indicator and is often disconnected from economic reality. But if those two things continue to align, where both the economy is dragging and perception of the economy is dragging, then you'll see that filter down at the electoral, at the voting box. Polling today would suggest that we're beginning to see some of that his approval numbers are they're a hodgepodge of reactions to the range of things that his administration's been doing. But at the end of the day, if people are discomfited by economic indicators, by the price of milk or eggs or the price of gas, that whoever's in charge is going to suffer for that.
Okay. Susan, Marie?
Somebody said a long time ago, it's the economy, stupid. And when it comes to elections, you can't be underwater heading into the election. Otherwise, it's going to cost you, as they've just said.
I think we can squeeze one quick final question in. I'm going to go to gentleman over here. Thanks.
And what are the challenges that we'll have to face, or the opportunities that
I think that one goes first to Murray.
Well, as I like to point out to people, mainly to do some of that discomforting stuff, is he's the most Scottish president ever. You know, and he could be a British citizen if he wanted to be. So the impact, well, I fear for our windmills and golf courses. No, I mean, they've already had impact. I mean, the tariffs have an impact, and some of the major exports from Scotland have been, you know, negatively impacted by these tariffs, could be negatively impacted. One thing is, I see we love these saying, you know, well, we've made a great trade agreement with the UK. Is that written down yet? And remember, I mean, trade agreements go, Trump blew up NAFTA and replaced it, and then he blew up his replacement this time around. So making a deal with the Trump administration is challenging. At the same time, Keir Starmer seems to have done quite well in managing the relationship with Trump, but that's definitely moving into your area. So, but what I would say is that there could be impacts, but at the same time, he has the family connection, and if there's anything that probably does connect with Donald Trump, it's that sense of Scotland. He's got property here, he's got connections here. I do love it when the Air newspaper says things like local hotel owner wins presidency. I still think that's the best headline I've ever read, but he does have, Donald Trump is very, we've heard the term transactional, and he's very Trump-focused, but he does have affection for Scotland. At the end of the day, that might be the one thing that helps us.
Very much agree with that. I mean, he's got vested interests here, as Mary's outlined, and I keep trying to think of an alternative for Trump card. Like, how can we get away with using that phrase? But effectively, you know, Scotland has a sort of Trump card in the sense that there is that relationship with Trump here and that sort of soft power. I think Keir Starmer has you know, walked a delicate line in the last 6 or 7 months, particularly. I have to say, I'm surprised an hour and a half in we haven't mentioned a lot of the recent events of the last few days in terms of internationally and what's been happening in the White House and in Alaska. But, you know, I think, you know, there are going to be a lot of challenges in that area, and European security, of course, is a huge concern. But maybe one of the positives is that we've seen a closening relationship with Europe, which I know Scotland, you know, very much positioned itself in wanting to strengthen in that area. So yeah, I haven't got a crystal ball though, so who knows what will happen in the long term, especially given how much happened in 7 months.
I mean, my take is, yeah, the president's a business person. He loves Scotland and he has a lot of money here, so that's good. And I also think that the United States is going to end up being a more balanced player in NATO. And so that would theoretically have an impact. I think that, as you're already seeing, the EU take on some stronger, more muscular stances, and I think that is good and could be good in some future. But I think also the special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. remains. It was the first deal that got cut, so it's like, yeah, it's good.
Okay, Jason, I'm going to invite you in last on that one, and also could you maybe wrap up your final thoughts for the audience as well?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think that the US-UK or US-Scotland relationship is in any way under some kind of a direct threat, despite the fact that I gain an abiding joy from seeing some of the signs that the citizens of Scotland put up every time Trump visits their country. I do think that the UK and Scotland will be indirectly affected by ongoing events in Europe, particularly as it pertains to Ukraine and Russia. As other countries in the region begin to react, I think it's inevitable that the UK will be forced to take to react or take different positions based on those European realities. But yeah, Bob said it. The special relationship will continue. I think just in closing, these these panels on American politics have just become sort of increasingly depressing. I love talking about American politics, and I love that the people in Scotland love talking about American politics, and I'm grateful for the chance to come every year and talk about American politics. But talking about American politics has become exhausting, um, and I can't. What I will say though is I still, as part of my job, and Bob and I share the same job, I get to travel around the country and talk to Americans in their sort of in their natural environments. Many of whom, much to Murray's chagrin, I'm sure, don't talk or think about politics on a regular basis. They view Washington with a both distant and jaundiced eye. It's interesting that in the last few years, much of the power in the United States has shifted away from Washington and more into the states. And while I don't know how much comfort I take from that, it does present a different way of analyzing the American political tapestry. And I think as people who are obviously, you in the room, are interested in American politics, I would just counsel that you spend less time focused on the red meat of federal American politics and the headlines that Trump manages to squeeze in every day that the U.S. media loves to focus on. The real work and the real politics is increasingly being done at the state level and state capitals across the United States. And if you are really interested in keeping your fingers on the pulse of American politics and policy and how it ultimately may affect Scotland and the UK, I would suggest you spend some time digging in more deeply on what's happening at the state level in the United States.
Okay.
Or you could just sign up for one of my courses. I'm just saying.
Pitches not allowed. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, Jason said something I think is really, really important. It's something he and I have talked about many years here over drinking your national product, which is that, okay, we're in democracies. And could it be that that our democracies are so large that it's hard for the individual or hard for people to get their heads around it, or for them to act in a way that's consistent with local views? And you've gone through devolution here, right? And that's why we're sitting in this parliament. And it's really sort of an interesting question. I've been really mulling over. It's like, at what point does a society become so big it's hard for it to operate democratically at that scale? And does it need to have a democracy at those subunits? I think it's an interesting question. I think it might turn out that the United States returns somewhat to being much more of this much more of a federal system than it was during the Cold War, and that maybe we're not as demonstrative internationally because we don't have consensus, or maybe we are because we have consensus on a couple big things like China, but that it might be that in the future, with some of our democracies, they're so large. I think about Brazil and India, for example, right? That a lot of the effort a lot of the difference and a lot of the energy and a lot of the innovation might be in different states. And that might not be bad. I mean, I think everyone in this room wants a democracy, okay? So it might be that maybe that's what it looks like. It's more devolution, and you're still connected to these larger organizations like the EU or within them. It's an interesting question.
It comes as no surprise to say that, all joking aside, I believe that the answer lies in education. I think there comes responsibilities with the rights of being a citizen, and I think that some of the moves that we've made recently, we need to realize that the world changing significantly, the way that we communicate, the way we engage is changing significantly, but the nature of democracy requires all of us to understand that we have those responsibilities which we must exercise as much as we like to exercise the rights. And I think that's something we just need to drive home through our education. We talk about civic education, and I just sometimes feel that we don't do it as well as we should. At the same time, I would say that we are going through yet another what we call industrial revolution. Who knows what it's going to look like out the other side? All I know is that just as my father couldn't program the VCR, I'm like, another app? I can hardly handle the ones I got on my phone. So.
Susan?
I would just build on what you were saying there, Murray. I think I was at an event a couple of months ago with colleagues working on the kleptocracy space in the US, and they were really sort of sounding the alarm to us that were there, saying, you know, just be aware of what's happening in your own, you know, countries, and you know, standing up and making sure that you are protecting, you know, those fundamental freedoms that we so often can take for granted. And I think there's also, you know, there's always going to be shifting global dynamics. There's opportunities for countries, particularly even smaller countries, to really kind of be exemplary on the world stage in terms of the actions they take and living up to those democratic norms and principles. So as we're sitting in Scotland, I think there's a real opportunity for Scotland to do that, but also the UK.
Can I ask everyone to thank the panel in the usual manner? Thank you to everyone in the audience who asked questions and participated. I hope you've enjoyed the event. I think my takeaway will be looking at the difference in what democracy means in different areas. So we've seen how a country with a convention and a constitution rather has still has issues with how that constitution can be manipulated. And of course you mentioned devolution, but we've finding our own battles against a constitution that's based on convention and not rules. So very interesting to hear those comments. So thank you everyone. I hope you've enjoyed your day. Enjoy the rest of the day. It's a beautiful afternoon in Edinburgh. I'm sure you're all going to enjoy it. Thank you very much.